away.
Thank you, Dylan. Hey folks, so my name is Jax Lastinger. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a coordinator for residence life here at Appalachian State University. So I have a Master's of Science in Education and Education, Culture, and Society from the University of Pennsylvania. And when I was in grad school, I was doing research about the experiences of trans youth in education and on social media. So looking at the ways that trans youth were using like those institutions to their benefit, but also looking at the ways that like institution structure or limit their abilities to fully be themselves. So that is part of my research, and I identify as trans and have been working in residence life since I was a sophomore in undergrad. So that's kind of like where those two interests intersect for me. So before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that like as much research as I've done and as invested as I am in this community, that doesn't mean that I'm an expert. And I fully believe in the collective knowledge that we have in this group of, we're at 77 people right now. You all know stuff that I don't know, and I want us to be able to like be in this session together and to like learn from each other's experiences as well. Also, I want to acknowledge that I am not a lawyer, nor am I really a policy expert. So a lot of the issues that impact trans students are impacted by the laws and policies of your institution or of your state or region or whatever. So, I will do my best. I will do my best to answer those types of questions, but that's not like my expertise area. Yeah. So before we get started, I also want to acknowledge that we are, collectively located on Native land. And I want to acknowledge that where I am in North Carolina, it's the land of the Eastern Cherokee tribe. So I just want to name that. And if you're interested in learning like where you are, I'm just going to drop this link really quick. So it's called nativeland.ca, and if you Google it, I think it's native-land.ca. But if somebody finds the link, feel free to drop that in the chat. That would be great. So that's a resource that you can use to identify like whose land you're on. And I also want to acknowledge in that like vein that the issues that impact trans students are very much tied up in colonization and racism. And this presentation won't be able to like fully address that in a way that I would like, but I also want to like name that, like trans youth of color, trans women of color are disproportionately impacted by violence. So that is a thing that we need to be aware of when we're talking about this issue. So if folks want to drop in the chat real quick, I would love to know like what brings you here today or what you're trying to get out of this session. I'll just repeat that in case anyone missed it. So I'd love to know in the chat, like what brought you to this session today and what you're trying to get out of this session. Great, so we have like supporting trans students, looking at policies for assignments, accommodating students and making them feel supported, creating an inclusive environment, RA placement being interrupted, not satisfied with trans housing options, same. Cool, okay, great. Well, feel free to like read over those so you can, know your fellow participants a little bit better. So just a review of the session, we're gonna start off with like covering some basics, and then we'll review some housing policies and practices, and I'll give you my take on what some best practices are. And that'll be kind of like the bulk of the section, and then we'll have like a closing reflection activity. Great. So to start off, I'm going to share a video that will kind of help us get on like the same, on the same ground, I guess. So we're all using like language that we're understanding each other for. So let me know if the sound is like not working.
Traditionally, we tend to gender as decided by the body we're born in.
People are usually assigned female or male at birth.
But bodies and gender are actually pretty separate things.
Gender is basically part of someone's internal sense of self.
It can be male, female, neither, a mix of both, or exist totally outside of that.
A person's relationship with their gender can also change over time as well.
The gender we're assigned at birth usually gets reinforced by the people around us over our lives.
Hearing things like, be a man, or you're such a girl.
It can feel like we're being told who we're supposed to be.
Most people feel comfortable with the gender that they're assigned.
But for some people, that label never quite fits and doesn't feel right.
That's what's called being
Transgender!
You've probably heard the term transgender or even gender diverse.
That's when your gender doesn't entirely match the one you're assigned at birth.
A lot of people use trans for short.
That can mean the gender you were assigned felt meaningless, restrictive, or altogether just didn't quite fit.
That might seem like a pretty broad definition, and that's because it is.
And the most important thing you need to know,
There's no one right way to be trans.
There are a lot of different ways people might identify.
It's not about knowing every single one.
But rather being open to difference when you encounter it.
And also keep in mind that gender and sexuality are largely separate things.
Lesbian, bisexual, asexual, gay, and straight are a few different examples.
But we're all those things in addition to being trans.
They're not the reason we're trans.
I think for me, there's kind of been this expectation that I transitioned because I like guys and wanted to get with them more easily. Actually, I'm a super gay lesbian.
When we talk about gender identity, people often think of two opposing groups.
A binary of female and male, and that when you're trans, you go from one to the other. But there's a lot more to it than that.
Putting it simply, non-binary is an umbrella term people use
To describe gender that doesn't fit squarely into male or female.
And this can include people who feel that their gender is a mix of both.
Changes often,
Or as something totally separate.
Or have no strong sense of gender at all.
Different people might use more specific terms to describe their gender, whilst others use non-binary.
And trans people who aren't non-binary
Who identify as strictly male or female.
might describe themselves as binary.
There's also a term for people who aren't trans. That's cisgender.
Cisgender is a way of saying not trans. You might also...
Okay. Great. So, I want to start off, based off of that and building off of that with a definition of the term cissexism. Has anyone heard of this term before? You can raise your hand or react.
Can you say it again, please? Sorry.
Cissexism. Okay, how about the term transphobia? Okay. I see some more nodding of heads. So if anybody did say yes to learning about the term or knowing about the term cissexism, would you drop something in the chat, or maybe unmute yourself and help us get started on a definition? Okay. So I'm going to drop the definition that I like to use in the chat, just for your reference. So I define cissexism as the systemic form of oppression that teaches us that being cisgender is normal, natural, and default, and that variants outside of cisgender experiences and expressions of gender are abnormal, obscene, or somehow wrong. Cissexism also includes the idea that gender and sex are inherently tied to each other, and that the only two genders or sexes that exist are male and female. So transphobia is part of cissexism. It's kind of like a subsection of cissexism. So transphobia would be, for example, the targeted violence that trans people experience or microaggressions that trans people experience. But cissexism kind of names the broader societal structure that we live under. And the reason that we distinguish that, is because, lots of oppressions, it doesn't take somebody being intentionally hateful for that oppression to manifest. But one of the reasons that we have this different term is also to distinguish the ways that Cissexism exists even when people aren't hating trans people. So like you can be cissexist or participate in cissexism, even if you're not like, you know, like hating on trans people explicitly. So that's a really important distinction. And I think in general, when we're talking about oppression and we're talking about supporting marginalized students, like it's important to acknowledge that it just because you aren't aware of your bias, or you don't think that you have, you know, hateful feelings towards a certain group, that doesn't mean that you're not, or that you can't be a part of the problem. Like anyone and everyone can and is part of the problem. Yeah, so that's just kind of a way for us to get started on that. So the next thing I'm going to do is, has anybody heard of the oppression tree before? Yeah, okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen again. And we're going to do a little presentation. Cool. So this is the oppression tree. And I like the oppression tree a lot because it helps us understand how systemic oppression operates. So we, at the roots, we have the system. So we could have things like colonization, racism, ableism, cissexism, heteropatriarchy, all those things. Those would be examples of systems. And then we also have our branches, which are the beliefs and practices that support that system. And then we have leaves. So those are the visible outcomes of that oppression. And what I like about the oppression tree is that it serves a lot for this metaphor. So for example, just because you don't see the leaves or the visible outcomes on the oppression tree doesn't mean that the tree is dead, right? So it could be winter and the leaves have just fallen off and you don't see the visible outcomes of that oppression. But that doesn't mean that the beliefs and practices aren't still there. And that definitely doesn't mean that the roots aren't still there. So to get rid of oppression, you really have to cut it at its root to make sure that the entire system has been interrupted. So in thinking about like cissexism, we can start and think about like, we can start from the bottom up and think about cissexism as being the root that we're gonna start with. So here we have our root, and would folks drop in the chat what you think some beliefs and practices might be of cissexism? And for some reason, I can't find the chat anymore. Oh, here it is. Great, so single gender bathrooms, that's a great example of a practice. Bathrooms and residence halls, definitely also a practice. Required counseling for individuals who want to transition, absolutely. Single sex halls, yep. Single gender housing assignments. Non-inclusive healthcare, that's definitely a practice. Can anyone think of some beliefs? Yeah, the boy toys and girl toys aisles are definitely an example of a practice, because that reinforces the idea, right, that like gender is something inherent to individuals and that individuals like certain things because of their gender or sex. Gender reveals, being a man, yeah, that's a belief. Cool, yeah, so some of the practices and beliefs that I identified are having like gendered spaces. So a lot of you named that. Forcing our students to use legal names. So for example, on applications to school or in other types of formal documentation, a lot of times trans folks are required to use legal names, even when your legal name is actually not relevant to that process. Forcibly outing people, that's another example of a practice. Forcing trans people to use private bathrooms or single user bathrooms, rather than saying like trans students are allowed to use the bathrooms that most closely match their identity. And some examples of some beliefs are that trans students have special or unique needs. That kind of reinforces the idea that trans people are like different or separate or other, when actually the issue is our system. The issue is not trans students. Another belief is that it's difficult, inconvenient, or impossible to have trans-inclusive residence spaces in trans-inclusive spaces in residence life. And also the belief that there aren't many trans people at your school. I can tell you point blank, that is not true. If you don't know them, it's because they don't feel comfortable telling you that they're there. So those are kind of some beliefs and practices that help reinforce the sexism at an institutional and societal level. and some examples of visible outcomes. So if folks want to drop in the chat some visible outcomes as well, that would be great. And yeah, Maxient does allow to pool preferred names. Oh, you can have it not show dead names. Interesting. I shall be speaking to some people at my institution about that. Sorry. But yeah, like banner is another one that is really difficult to work with. So some visible outcomes that I pulled out, which feel free to tag on and add somewhere in the chat. But a common one that we see, right, is bullying, harassment, violence, and discrimination against trans students. So trans students and queer students in general are disproportionately impacted by bias and harassment incidents in schools. And those experiences often lead to those students dropping out or having negative academic outcomes, which is, you know, I'm reading my own mind because that was my second bullet point, which is that trans students are often disengaged or perform quote unquote poorly academically, though of course we want to be critical of like what academic standards mean for marginalized students, and or they have higher rates of dropping out of school. And finally, trans students experience higher rates of mental and physical health challenges. So the mental health being that a lot of queer youth experience alienation and isolation because of their identities, rejection from families or communities, or denial of their existence by their communities. And in terms of physical health challenges, it can be really difficult as a trans person to access trans-inclusive healthcare. I've heard of people having doctors say that like they can't treat them for like, you know, a kidney infection or for a broken foot because they don't know how to treat trans patients, which is obviously like absurd, right? Because your transness doesn't impact every single health experience that you have. And, you know, there are other challenges to accessing healthcare in that way as well. Great. So any like questions or thoughts before I move on to our review of policies and practices? Feel free to drop in the chat or unmute yourself. I'm happy to have a conversation. Great, well, if a question comes up, feel free to drop that in the chat and I hope that I will see it. Great, so next I want to talk about some trans-inclusive housing policies and best practices. So I'm going to start with the best practices and then I'm going to move on to like things that you should not do or that you should avoid as much as possible. So one example of a trans-inclusive housing structure would be all gender halls or rooms, right? So we have that like in the sense that like often we have like co-ed dorms is how we talk about them, though we can kind of like unpack what the term co-ed implies, which is that there are two genders and we're working together. But so you can have halls that have like only single rooms. Those could be all gender buildings rather than being like all female or all male halls or having like the floors split according to sex. You could also have students opt in to gender neutral housing. So at my previous institution, we had an option where like all students were coded as M, F, or N, as in like neutral, which has its own problems, right? But like when we're talking about working at an institution, like, you know, there's always going to be cissexism at the institutional level. So we're trying to find ways like within housing or within our department that we can kind of work to unpack that or like make that experience better for trans students. So having like an N option allows students who have that label to be paired with another person who has that label. So that means that like you could be paired with somebody of any gender and you just don't know what that person's gender is. And often what we see with those structures is that you also end up having pairs of like siblings, for example, rooming together. So point being that like that having a structure like that is accessible not only to trans students, but also to other folks who might need access to gender specific housing that isn't really captured by our current system. So another option is that you can have a designated hall with mixed gendered experiences. So similar to like an all-female hall, you can have a community that's specifically dedicated to that type of experience. I've also seen institutions like University of California, Riverdale has a community that is dedicated to LGBT students. So that's another option. And each room in this like theoretical building would have the potential of being mixed gender. So students opt into that option. Another thing that you can do is have intentionally gender neutral bathrooms. So whether that means ensuring that every single user restroom is gender neutral or all gender, or converting multi-stall bathrooms to be gender neutral is another option, or converting multi-stall bathrooms to be single user bathrooms. And while you're in the process of converting your bathrooms, you should go ahead and make those bathrooms ADA compliant or accessible for students with disabilities. So another thing is that when you're conceiving of communities that are like LGBT centered, you also want to think about like whether these communities like are labeled as such, or if they're not. The benefit of them being labeled as intentional communities for queer youth or for queer students is that that creates a sense of like, you know, being at home or like having a community or having a shared like system of values or experiences with your residents. But it could also be that it outs students who are in that community, or it could alienate students who aren't ready to be out if they want or need gender inclusive housing options. So if you're going to go with that structure of like having a community that's dedicated to that, I would encourage you to also think about having other options elsewhere on campus where students can have that housing option without necessarily being outed by the fact that they live in like a certain building. So whatever process or practices you end up choosing for your institution or, you know, reforming at your institution, it's super important that this process is readily visible and accessible to students. Processes should not be buried in like the deepest corner of your website. They shouldn't be like the last question on an application or a form that's really difficult to find. And you shouldn't have one person on campus who is like the gatekeeper of this process, right? So having like one person be the sole person who runs this process means that, you know, that person has the ability to like, you know, wield that power in ways that are not accessible to students. It also makes it more difficult for students to access the process if like there's only one person that they can go to, or, you know, if that student doesn't have a good relationship with that one person, then that student could feel really alienated from the process. So that's another thing to be to consider. Another thing to think about is what like new or prospective students see about your process. So for example, like how are they perceiving your process when they're coming in? Like is the visibility or invisibility of that process making an impact on their decision to come to your institution? Because I can tell you straight up as a trans person, like the visibility of those types of policies definitely makes an impact for me on like whether I want to work at that institution or whether I want to study at that institution. Another thing to consider is that you should think about what the process looks like for students who come out through the course of the academic year. So are you offering like, you know, an option for a student to like move to a different building or to a different like residence style? You know, obviously we know that these are formative years for a lot of young people, and this might be a time where they're exploring their identity. It might be the first time that they've heard of these terms before. It might be the first time that they felt safe to explore their gender in a different way. So that's another thing to consider when you're thinking about your process. I know that, you know, at a lot of institutions, there's kind of a deadline after which like you can't change rooms, but thinking about what that change actually means for that student rather than what it means for the inconvenience of your administrative process. Because I would argue that trans students, you know, happiness and ability to be fulfilled and respected in their community is a lot more important than the bureaucratic burden that it places on us as professionals. Cool. So in addition, I would say that it's really important to consult with trans and gender diverse students themselves. They will have the most accurate user experience perspective to bring to your team. So, you know, I cannot see the housing application process for my institution. So I have no idea what it's like for a student to apply to live in housing on my campus. I would not be a good person to tell anyone what is a good way to change our housing application process because I don't even know what it looks like. Versus I'm sure there are like plenty of trans students on my campus who have gone through that process and who would be, you know, great people to ask their advice of like, what would make this process better for you? how would this process, how could we make this process more accessible or more inclusive, or like more accurately capture your experiences and your needs? So some things to, well, I'm going to answer this question first. So what advice do you have on how to support trans students who have been negatively impacted by a policy or biased behavior, et cetera, in our community? And I would say that the most important thing that you can do is to change in response to that feedback, right? I think like for me as a person who has given a lot of feedback in their time as a student about those processes, what's so frustrating is to have administrators or professionals respond and be like, I hear you, that sounds really hard, I'm so sorry, and then like not do anything to change it. And it's like, if you hear me and you recognize how hard it is, then what are you doing to change your process? Which is something I'm going to talk about in the things to avoid section as well. So another message in the chat was, we recently got access to change all databases to show the preferred names instead of dead names. Awesome. However, there's also a concern that as we go first gen programs, which include a lot of communication with family, any suggestions on supporting the student through technology databases without potentially outing them to possible family members? So that is a great question. And that's also something that I'm going to talk about in the things to avoid. But so being really conscious of students' privacy is something that's so important when working with trans students. So if you have a structure that allows preferred names to be used, I would say that it's important to, to be able to meet all students' needs. Like, you're going to want a system that allows for that flexibility of both names being present and also being really communicative and having students, like providing students the opportunity to say, like, under these circumstances, I'm comfortable with my name being used, and under these circumstances, I'm comfortable with my given name or my legal name or my dead name, however the student refers to that name. I am comfortable or need that name to be used, right? So we also know that trans students, in the college age, it might be a process of coming out for them. And so their families might not be aware or might not be supportive, or if they come out to their families, they might experience like financial, what is the word for that? Basically, they might get like cut off financially. So those are all things that we want to be really careful about and supportive of trans students' experiences. Does that answer your question, Mark? Awesome. Cool. So some other things to avoid. So forcing students to request accommodations, especially medical or disability accommodations. Y'all, please do not do this. So first of all, like, let's separate this out. So asking trans students to request an accommodation implies that like trans students or trans people are something like abnormal and that they need like your special help and assistance to please be able to live in this community. That's not how we want to frame inclusion for trans students, right? Like, our inclusion for trans students should be something default, and we're not thinking about it as like making an exception or making an accommodation. That should be built into our system to include those students. And the other part of like making students request like a disability accommodation or a medical accommodation, like, first of all, like further builds onto this like trope or this stereotype that being trans is an illness or that is like medically aberrant or something. That's not true. Like, being trans does not mean that you're sick or that you like need a medical accommodation. And reinforcing that stereotype is really harmful to trans students or to trans people in general. Not because having a disability is wrong, but because that being trans is just not a disability. So we're not trying to like conflate those experiences. And in the same, oh, that was my cat, sorry. In the same note, also thinking about how like often these types of like accommodations. So for example, if you live in a building where there's only one ADA room and that one ADA room is the only single room in your building, putting a trans student in that room means that you're taking that space away from a student with a disability, which is unfair to students with disabilities. So thinking about that as well. So another thing to avoid is having informal policies. So sometimes that's kind of like by necessity because, for example, in North Carolina, there are a lot of laws against, basically having like desegregated, like sex segregated, sex desegregated spaces, you know, like bathrooms and stuff like that. So we have to have informal policies in order to actually support those students. But as a general rule, having an informal policy makes that policy much more difficult for students to access, difficult for them to find, and difficult for them to use. So that's something to definitely avoid if you can. They can also, if you have an informal policy, it can also really lend itself to inequitable enforcement. So if you don't have it written down of like, we are holding ourselves as a department accountable to this process for trans students, what is preventing that individual who is running that process to be like, okay, like Crystal, you are allowed to have trans inclusive housing, but Mark, you're not allowed. I don't like you. So, you know, or like, Mark, you're not trans enough, so I'm not going to let you have access to this housing. So it kind of lends itself to that as well, which is kind of the same thing tying into like having one person be the gatekeeper of that process. That's another thing. That's also why we want to distribute the power. So another thing is processes that force students to justify or explain their gender identity to you. That really enforces cis-heteronormative power dynamics. So if you're familiar with heteronormativity, we're just tagging on the prefix of cis on there to kind of describe the ways that it also takes in gender in those systems as well. So for example, who are you as the administrator to decide whether a person is trans enough or not? You know, I would never position myself in, you know, I would never want to be in a position to decide whether a trans student is trans enough or not for me. So I would ask you not to put yourself in that position. And it also puts students in a really vulnerable position. And a lot of structures at institutions are like this, of like forcing marginalized students to like make their like plea to you to give them like the resources that they need is really alienating and disenfranchising for marginalized students. So processes, for example, like emergency funding often does this, where it's like you have to write like your sob story and tell the administrator who's in charge of that process why like you deserve as a marginalized person to get support from the institution, when really like we have a lot of like historical and systemic reasons to understand why a marginalized or underrepresented student deserves or needs support from our institution. Another thing which ties into Mark's question, so I'll just kind of skim on this, by remembering not to violate students' privacy. So for example, outing them to parents or family members, thinking about the communication that you're using with and about the student, and making sure that you're communicating with the student to know like in what realms they are comfortable with you using what kind of language. And also thinking about like the platforms that your department uses. So like what can your platform do to maximize inclusion for trans students? So for example, can you use like a preferred name policy, or can you use like the notes section to say like this student uses this name, they want it to be used in these contexts, but they don't want it to be used in those contexts. So those are some things to consider as well. And also the kind of final point that I will land on, which I spoke really quickly, so we have 15 minutes left. So if you have questions, please think of them and I'll be happy to talk about some other stuff as well. But so often I see, you know, when as professionals in higher education, that we have a lot of tendency to be like, oh, well, this isn't an urgent issue, so I can wait until next year, or I can wait till the next year after that, or I can wait until the year after that to address this issue. But if you're in a position to advocate or to make changes at your department, I would encourage you to make those changes sooner rather than later, because every year, every month that you delay that action is another year that trans students at your institution experience undue burden and a barrier to their educational experience. So even if it's something that like you see as like not being urgent, like trust me, it's probably urgent for the students who are trying to access that system. So that was kind of the end of what I had, and I'll go through some questions and then we'll kind of do our closing reflection before we wrap up. So I see in the chat, Amelia said, I would love to hear any ideas about how to identify safe roommates for out trans students. Yeah, so first I want to open it up to the floor. Does anybody have a response to or thoughts about how their institution has done that? Feel free to just unmute yourself.
I can kind of just tell you what we've been doing, and I'm assuming there are other better ways to do it. But we do have a lot of students who are asking us to call roommates where they've been assigned, and it feels odd to me because essentially they're asking to be outed to these roommates who they've never met. So we're making the initial contact, which thankfully, like, I've not had a negative experience doing that, which I think says a lot about the generation that's younger than my own, which I think is awesome, or the generations now. But I would love to have some way to identify students who would be safe roommates ahead of time so that we didn't have to be so reactive, we could be proactive.
Yeah, so I think like what you're doing sounds like a great option if students are asking you explicitly for that. Like that sounds like that's probably working for you all. Another way that you could build that in like preemptively is to have part of your application to housing include some type of question that captures inclusion to trans people. So for example, saying like, you know, like, would you feel comfortable if you were paired with a trans student? Now, the thing that I will say about that process is that often cis people are very like, and you know, no offense to the cis people in this call, but like sometimes y'all are fragile. And so you want to say that you're like welcoming to trans people, and then a trans person shows up in your family or shows up in your community, and all of a sudden you're like not cool with it. So I think that's something to be aware of if like you're going to build that into the application process, kind of having like a, you know, describing like what exactly it means and like what the implications of that could be. It could also be an optional question rather than like a mandatory question on your application process, which could kind of weed out some folks who are like uncomfortable with answering the question. But it's definitely a huge challenge, right? Because we live in a society that reinforces the idea that it's okay to be transphobic and that it's normal to like be cis-sexist or to have all of these ideas about gender. So Yasas, it looks like your hand is up.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of jump on that in like a similar way that we do in our housing application, have a section that says, you know, I'm open to mixed gender, transgender housing, open inclusive housing. But often we find that once we assign people, and then, you know, vacancies come up and then we assign someone who is non-binary or trans, it was the cis person's idea of it was, oh, they're only fully transition or they're more leaning to one side. So even in having that like required question, it's in their mind, it's not a spectrum. It's I don't believe in the spectrum. I believe this and that. So I don't know if there is I think that's a systematic issue of like what people believe that is to be, but I don't know if that even having a mandatory question still solves the issue. I think something our admissions and what's it called, orientation groups are trying to do is to push some of that messaging out earlier so that they have a baseline understanding of like what it is to live with someone who isn't like you or in general. And so hopefully that's helping, but I don't have any data to support that.
Yeah, that's a really great point. You know, I think another thing that we can do in addition to that is making sure that like our residence education curriculum, or that our like residence hall communities are starting out really strong from the get-go of like making sure that like those inclusion, you know, resources and practices and education are starting out strong at the beginning of the fall semester, so that students who are in that type of situation, like we intervene with that really quickly. And also making sure that students, you know, who are trans, if we have access to that information, and if they feel comfortable like requesting support from our department, making sure that we're following up with them and supporting them throughout the semester and the academic year. Renee, do you have a response to this or a separate question?
No, to this. So similar to what, is it Yasas? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the pronunciation. We have an optional question, and what we found is that we can't just stop at that. Like, so if someone answers yes, that they would be comfortable, we follow up with an email with a series of questions. And I would say 7 out of 10 times somebody accidentally hit yes. And so that could have been really, really a bad situation had it just moved from that point. And so I would definitely recommend, if you add that question, that there's a follow-up application process or whatever that really explains what you meant by that. Similarly, we have a criminal record question, and constantly we're having to follow up with someone and they're like, I accidentally hit yes. So I think we've got a lot of clickers who aren't reading. So I would just be very cautious with something that's sensitive of just making it a yes, no, you know, and giving a little bit more.
That is awesome, Renee. Thank you so much. And that I love that process as well, because it puts the burden on us as a department and on the students who are saying that they're willing to be roommates with a trans student. It puts the work on them rather than putting the work on the trans student to find their own roommate or do whatever they need to do. So to move on to another question, Alex in the chat said, what are your thoughts on being inclusive fiscally when trying to create an inclusive space for students? For example, prices vary over $1,000 per semester based on which hall you live in. How do we make it equitable? Some of the pricier buildings would be better suited by design. Let's start by making all tuition and housing free for all students. Let's start there. No, I'm just kidding. But so I would say that you can start by making sure that you have inclusive housing options in many or all of your buildings and at different price points. So depending on what the specific housing options on your campus are, that could look really different. But yeah, that's probably where I would start. The next question, we do not have a next question. Cool. But somebody shared some resources in the chat. So at Tulane, we have a gender affirming housing and oh, sorry, I lost the question. We'll have our first cluster starting in the fall acting as an LLC, but we have offered it in many buildings. So that's awesome. One thing that I've seen as well is that in those communities that are intentionally gender neutral or inclusive or whatever, that sometimes we see, you know how I mentioned earlier that sometimes you see sibling pairs. So sometimes you'll get a pair of siblings or students who are together, not for gender reasons or LGBT reasons, but for other reasons, come into that community for access to gender inclusive housing. And then it turns out that they're not on the same page about trans issues or inclusion as the rest of the community. So that can kind of be a gap that you want to make sure you're aware of when you have a community like that. Any Tennessee folks with experience working in the legislature, please reach out to Viviana because I do not live in Tennessee. So at a college with a very conservative administration, we have a beyond the binary clause in all of our housing information, not where I want to be, but much closer to where we were 4 years ago. Feel free to steal, edit, etc. if you're looking for a starting point. Quote, no two students are alike, and at Ferrum College, we recognize this. We work to ensure that all students have an opportunity to prosper. Students who inform Ferrum College Office of Student Life in a timely manner that they identify beyond the binary or as transgender will be housed in keeping with their gender identity. And every attempt will be made to give those students safe and comfortable housing. That is awesome. Love that as a starting off point. So I'm interested in where/how you market your gender inclusive housing availability and process. So I would say it should be part of your application process, that there should be an option or information for students to access in that process. Anywhere that you have information about how to apply to housing or what kinds of communities you have in your residence life department, make sure that the information is there. And also social media is your friend. I know some of us are scared of it, but really going hard on social media can do a lot for your department and your brand in general, but can also reach those students who might not be on your website. So during my undergrad at UNC Greensboro, there was a page on the website with a list of bathrooms that were gender neutral across campus for ease of access, and a list of faculty and staff in their office spaces who have been through safe zone training, so you know where you can find an ally. Love this visibility so much. Yeah, so one thing I've noticed, I'm doing some research about gender neutral bathrooms for a policy that we're implementing at our institution. One thing I've noticed is that often those lists of gender neutral bathrooms don't include bathrooms in residence halls because they're not available to every student on campus. So something to look into could be where are the gender neutral bathrooms in our department? And we also had a out list at my previous institution that was just a list of faculty and staff who were out and willing to be support people to LGBTQ students. I would be happy to send out a handout and info to participants. Feel free to reach out to me. So I will drop my info in the chat. So you can email me at lastingerlj@appstate.edu. Again, that's Lastinger, my last name, lj@appstate.edu. And I'd be happy to get you in touch with some other resources. And I'm also going to drop a link in the chat for a book called Trans Policies and Experiences in Housing and Residence Life. And that is a link to a book that, you know, basically talks about a lot of the stuff that we talked about today. So feel free to check that out. So as our closing reflection, I just want everyone to like pull out a piece of paper and a pen, or, you know, your notes on your computer, however you best process. And I want you to spend a minute reflecting on what you learned today and how you plan to bring this knowledge to your own practice as an educator and or to your department and institution. So we're just gonna like have a moment of silence so you can like think about that question. And when you're done, feel free to like drop some of the stuff that you thought about in the chat. That's awesome. I'm really glad to hear that, Amelia. So Amelia put in the chat, they want to put our process in writing, work to make our process more visible, and add another question to the application. Does anyone else have any takeaways that they want to share? Thank you, Nicole. I'm planning to follow up in my, oh, thanks, Amelia. That was really nice of you to say. I'm planning to follow up with my department in terms of Maxient and making sure that Maxient pulls preferred names, because currently how we have it set up, it pulls the legal name over the preferred name. So Crystal says, I plan to state that we need to support/address processes for trans students as their own group and not just lump them into the LGBTQ+ community. Absolutely, Crystal, I 100% agree. Alexis is hoping to better understand their institution's current process and how transparent it truly is. D, overall changing the language, removing words like accommodations. That's awesome. Glad to hear that. Great. Well, it's 12 o'clock now. I don't want to keep you over time, but thank you so much to everyone who came out and who participated really actively. I'd love to be in touch with some of you, especially if you're queer. Please like hit me up. Like I want to be friends. So I appreciate you being here today. Have a great day.